Thank you, Dr. Post. Thanks so much. And it's been really a wonderful experience to be here and see how much you do in the humanities, inspiring and humbling for people like me that are trying to start one at the institution. In many ways, Leonardo da Vinci is a perfect fit for this because it's the epitome of the fact that the boundaries between art and science are purely illusory. He would have laughed at the theory that there are indeed two cultures. I put together this talk last November because we had a symposium on arts and medicine at Jefferson, and then eventually this became a paper that actually won the Vesalius Prize because, as you probably know, 2 weeks from now, we will celebrate the 500th anniversary of the birth of Vesalius. Now, Vesalius is the one who gives us back anatomy. But Leonardo got there first. There is always an Italian who gets there first and then he gets screwed. There is a German school of thought that believes that actually Vesalius was aware of the work of Leonardo that was kept by Francesco Melzi not too far from Padua. And being Vesalius, and his personality wasn't particularly charming, would definitely not have credited Leonardo. The last reason why I put this together is because for the past 20 years I was reminded daily that I come from a genetic pool that produced this man. And so it's kind of reassuring that I also came from a genetic pool that produced this man. And the two could not have been any more different. And Leonardo tells us about it. He says, "I wish to work miracles. This may mean that I will eventually own less than other men with more quiet lives, or than those who want to get rich in a day. I may even have to live for a long time in great poverty, as often happens, and to all eternity will always happen to those who want to acquire knowledge. Yet, don't call riches those that may be lost. Virtue is our only true wealth, and the true reward of its possessor. As for property and material wealth, these you should always hold in fear, since they often leave their possessor in shame, mocked at for having lost them all. So study me, reader, if you delight in me." And we delight in the man, and we study him. And these are all the anatomical drawings he left us. All of them, even though the one that particularly touches me is the one that is coming down now. This is a work of art, and this is a work of science. Martin Kemp wrote a paper in Nature calling it a miracle of intense presentation, and this is the epitome that the boundaries between art and science are illusory. He gave us 200 anatomical drawings, and he dissected 30 men, women, and children. We know that because he told the Spanish ambassador when he retired to France. And this, of course, has become an app. So if you have an iPad, you can spend $13.99 and purchase this amazing app put together for the Queen of England by a British company. I would strongly recommend it. When I first got to Leonardo as a wide-eyed med student in Rome, they were having an exhibit in nearby Florence in 1979. The Queen had sent out of her own treasury, which is, again, 268 folios, only 60, and I went to Florence by train and I was amazed. This that he left is probably 2/3 of the original production. They are breathtakingly beautiful, they are pioneering in knowledge, and there is no doubt that medicine starts with this work. Leonardo blurred the boundaries between art and science and took tremendous personal risk, physical risk, professional risk, and they are undoubtedly, to me at least, his greatest accomplishment as a human being. Leonardo knew that this was going to be groundbreaking, and he actually wanted to write a book, and had picked a title, De Figura Humana, the human figure, and we know that because he writes it on top of this folio. If you flip it, because remember Leonardo wrote right to left, and probably because he was dyslexic, you have to flip it in order to read the Italian, and it says, "Year of the Lord, April 2nd, 1489, write a book titled The Human Figure." Now, unfortunately, Leonardo was also blessed with the worst case of ADD you can ever imagine, so he never really finished much, and he never published a single book. If he had done so, his discovery would have completely changed medical knowledge. But when he died in 1519, his thoughts, scattered in these books, pretty quickly went all over Europe. It's almost sad, and in fact, Leonardo is fascinating because of that that he's such a tragic and elusive figure. It's almost like God said, I'm going to make you a genius, but I'm going to make you irrelevant. And unfortunately, he was irrelevant. It's only in 1774 that a librarian at Windsor Castle calls William Hunter, the founder of OB-GYN, and says, Dr. Hunter, in this chest I found this stuff. Are you interested? Remember, he was working on placental vessels. Imagine his face when he saw the fetus in the womb. The first facsimile is only published in 1892, so we're talking about literally 400 years after Leonardo finished them. And by the way, this year is the 500th anniversary, more or less, of when Leonardo was denounced to the church by a collaborator, a German collaborator, for necromancy and mistreatment of cadavers, and the church told him to stop. And that's why it's, I think, so timely to review his work. Now, why he never really got these things published? Because when he died, he left them to Francesco Melzi. He was a 27-year-old lad that had followed him to France. He was a Milanese aristocrat, and he was profoundly devoted to his mentor. He took them all back to Villa Melzi, not too far from Padua, and he tried to assemble them into a book, but he never was successful. Leonardo gave him 55 notebooks. These were leather-bound notebooks that Leonardo recommended you should always carry attached to your belt by a chain, because whenever you have an idea, you have to jot it down. He told his students, and you have to do it ideally as a sketch, because his was a brain that thought in pictures. It's a total of 6,000 pages that we have, which basically means half of all his ideas were lost. And it's a problem that goes back directly to him. Leonardo was convinced that to conceive an idea is noble, to execute it is servile. Now, how did he do these sketches, these drawings? There were three major techniques. The first one was metal point. This was a silver-tipped stylus that you used with specially coated paper. There was a reaction between the silver of the tip and the coating that created the image, as, for example, this amazing drawing of a frog's spinal cord. But in this area, you see absolutely nothing. And this is because the silver-tipped stylus drawing was bound to fade. You can only see it through UV light. And that's why Leonardo went back to his home, and at night had to retouch them with ink and pen. And this is how he produced his amazing drawings. So most, if not all, of his anatomical drawings are indeed done in that style. You can also see the hatching, the dithering pattern, which is top left, bottom right, which is indicative that this was made by a left-handed man. And also notice again this pioneering the idea of the cross-section, which allows to see the parts and the whole and cavities that would have been otherwise unexplored. Leonardo also used red chalk, which was quarried in special parts of Europe, not particularly common, and not a lot of his work uses red chalk. In fact, of his anatomical drawings, there's only this one where he got so touched by the fetus that he, again, touched it up with red chalk. He also used charcoal, not a lot, and all of this during the period that goes between 1479, when Leonardo was 27, till very much the time that the church told him to stop. Leonardo, at the same time, had to make a living, and he produced amazing portraits. This is Ginevra Benci, which is the only one in this hemisphere at the National Gallery. He pioneered this idea of the dark background, which was taken up by Rembrandt and by Caravaggio later. He was also producing instruments of war for the people that paid his salary, and this amazing bird view of cities. He was trying to honor the memory of the ancestors of the people that paid his bills and dabble in architecture, while also producing some of the most iconic artwork of the Renaissance, including the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa. But through it all, there were two things that never left his brain. They were his two hobbies. He didn't get paid for it. And they were flight and anatomy. Okay? When Baldassare Castiglione actually wrote the book of The Courtier, he had Leonardo da Vinci in mind, because The Courtier, according to Castiglione, was a brain for hire. and Leonardo was a brain for hire. So when at the age of 27 he's imprisoned in Florence under anonymous accusations of sodomy, he's jailed for 6 months, and he realizes that it's time to get out, he sends a letter to Ludovico the Moor, who's the Duke of Milan. And Milan is the court in Italy immediately after the Medici court in Florence that is the richest and the ones with the greatest number of resources. He sends him this letter written in normal Italian, and the top of it only highlights his skills in producing instruments of war. It's only at the end that he says, by the way, I'm also an artist. All of this because he knew that in the Italy of his time, war was big. And Leonardo was a pacifist. War is the most bestial madness, but he had to make a living. The Italy he lived in had mostly 3 cities that play a role in Leonardo's life. They were his native Florence, he was born outside Florence, 20 miles away, was the Milan where he came of age, and ultimately Rome, where he stayed until he left for France. Leonardo is apprenticed when he's 12, 13 by his father to Verrocchio, Vero Occhio, the true eye, the good eye, who teaches him to become an artist. It's interesting that Leonardo, one of the most creative, if not the most creative person produced by our species, did have very formal education. And in fact, it's interesting that 3 of the most creative people on the planet, which were indeed Leonardo and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Edison, all share this unique property of having received very little formal education. Makes you wonder what education does to creativity. In Florence, he dissects, but it's mostly as part of his artistic training. It's only when he goes to Milan, and he spends 20 years there, so he lives in his 50s, that he starts dabbling into scientific dissection, mostly because of the university town of Pavia. Then the French take Milan, and he goes down to Florence. He dissects at the Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova, which still stands, and then he goes back to Milan, and this is a good period of 4 years where he teams up in Pavia with Marcantonio della Torre, who's an anatomist and a friend, and the 2 men decide to write the book. Problem is there is a plague epidemic, and in 1512 Marcantonio della Torre dies. Leonardo at this point goes to Rome, because Rome is where the money is. It's coming from the New World. Charles V is sending the silver and the gold that he's raping out of Central and South America to Rome to build St. Peter. And the problem is Leonardo is considered passé. He's now pushing 60, and in Rome there is this young upstart called Michelangelo, who's very abrasive and hates Leonardo. There's Raphael. So he doesn't get commissions. He still dissects at the Ospedale di Santo Spirito for his own interest. And Ospedale di Santo Spirito still stands, and I got 15 stitches to my armpit as a kid back in the 60s. And that's where he gets denounced and realizes a year before Luther that it's time to get out. Goes to France, and he will die there 3 years later. All of this because he was doing this work, which, as you can imagine, didn't go down too well with this. So he goes to France, and he's a guest of the king. The king puts him up in a chateau connected by a special tunnel so that the king can pay unexpected visits and just enjoy the conversation of Leonardo. And it's in this room, which is very much kept the way it was, that on May the 2nd, 1519, he passes. In that bed, and near the bed, there is this much more recent painting by Ingres showing the king of the artist dying in the arms of the king of the French. This scene never happened because that day the king of the French was out hunting. But there is no doubt that Francois I was besotted by Leonardo, because Benvenuto Cellini tells us. Leonardo was a man of such plentiful and great talents that King Francois was totally besotted with his great virtues, and took such pleasure in hearing him discourse that there were only a few days when he was parted from him, which is also the reason why Leonardo could finish nothing. Well, that was not really the reason. I can't help by repeating the words I heard the king say of him. He said he could never believe there was another man born in this world who knew as much as Leonardo, and not only of sculpture, painting, and architecture, but also philosophy, of which he was a great practitioner. So he dies and is buried there. And this is another fascinating aspect. He may not even be there anymore because the chapel is looted during the revolution and the graves are open. And in fact, it's possible that that grave is empty. So here is the iconic picture that we're all familiar with. It's a red chalk on paper. It's a self-portrait. It's produced by a left-handed man because of the hatching pattern. It's a small folio and appears suddenly in Milan only in 1810. Within a few years, it's copied for the frontispiece of a book on Leonardo Last Supper and then immediately disappears. When he reappears again in 1839, it's sold to the Duke of Savoy, who eventually becomes the King of Italy. And that's why it's in Turin. Not too far from where the Shroud of Turin, by the way, is kept. And it's one of the most iconic, famous images in the world. It's in bad shape, there are molds on it, and they don't show it a lot. The last time that finally was shown in a museum was in 2011, and it got there, and I'm not making this up, at 11 a.m. of 11/11/11. Totally unintentional, and yet 11 is the number of genius, which is clearly what Leonardo was, the most eclectic. Sigmund Freud only wrote a biography and was about Leonardo da Vinci, a man, as he put it, that awoke too early in the darkness while everybody else was still asleep. Let's take a look at this portrait. Kenneth Clark wrote about it. This great furrowed mountain of a face, with its noble brow, cavernous eyes, and undulating foothills of beard, is like the face of all great men of the 19th century, as the camera preserved them for us. Darwin, Tolstoy, Walt Whitman. It's a few masterful lines, and we see the face of an old sage with a broad forehead, bushy eyebrows, sad, pensive, baggy eyes. Notice that the upper lip is receding, and it's very likely that Leonardo had lost his frontal teeth, very common in those years. He's got a long flowing beard, and that is unusual, because as this contemporary tells us, Sabba da Castiglione, the Italy of those years did not have beards, unless you were an eccentric or you were a mourner. And Leonardo was both. This was a man who relished the idea of being a party and a religion of one, and he was indeed in those years mourning the death of his father. Now, how do we know that this is Leonardo? First of all, because it's written below it. In Italian, there is not Leonardo's handwriting. We have these fading words that says Leonardo painted by himself at a very old age. And by the way, recently I was writing a piece on Rembrandt's self-portraits, and I realized that the term self-portrait only appears in 1830, when we became self-conscious. And now, of course, we got selfies, which is that to the utmost. Till then, they really wrote about painted by himself. But again, how do we know it's him? Because they tell us that that's the way he looked. A contemporary writes, Leonardo's face had long hair, bushy eyebrows, long flowing beard, to the point that he resembled all that is noble in study and knowledge. Now, Leonardo was also described as looking much older than his age. He had aged really badly. In this portrait, he's in his mid-60s. He looks in his 80s. He also looks sad, he looks pensive, and Leonardo is the epitome of the misanthropic humanist. He loved mankind, he had a problem with human beings. He writes, "The stultified multitude. Independent-mindedness is what saves us. If you are alone, you're all yours, but if you are with someone, you're only half yours. When I see a man holding a book, I often expect him to sniff it like a monkey, or wonder if it's edible. And last but not least, most human beings are only good for filling toilets." Now, there is, of course, a representation of Leonardo by Raphael, and we know that this is indeed Leonardo, and I'm talking about the School of Athens. Raphael portrayed himself in a cameo in this, and he also put down Michelangelo, which you see in the front as the lonely figure. But that man with a pink toga is Leonardo playing Plato, and we do know that Leonardo loved to wear pink. This is 1509, and Leonardo is 59. That's the way he looked when he was 65. Here is a 59. And here is a Francesco Melzi's rendition, still owned by the Queen of England, of Leonardo at 55. How did he look like when he was a young man? Well, this thing comes up. This was shown at the Morgan Library last spring, and I actually traveled from Philadelphia to New York to see it. It's part of the Codex on the Flight of Birds, which is also kept in Turin, and you see there a sketch on flight. But I want you to squint and tell me whether you see anything else on this folio. Do you see that central face? Believe it or not, these have been missed for 400 years. Even the curator of the Morgan Library didn't point it out. He really took an Italian TV journalist that made a show on this thing to ask the curator, by the way, what is that face on the page? And the curator said, you're right, there is a face. So through computer technology, they brought it out. And then they matched it to the famous iconic self-portrait and its perfect congruity. Of course, that face doesn't have a beard because that page of The Flight of Birds came out when Leonardo's father hadn't died yet. So again, Leonardo only grew a beard as a sign of mourning and then he kept it. But what did he look like a young man? Do we have any other self-portrait? A contemporary writes about the fact that he was portraying himself a lot. Here is what he writes. There is a painter nowadays who has so fixed in his conception the image of himself that whenever he wishes to paint somebody else, he actually paints himself. So what's the very first self-portrait? It's the very first thing Leonardo ever produced. It's the first oil he ever produced, the first full painting he ever produced, which is this Adoration of the Magi. His father got him the commission. He's still in Florence, and Leonardo pocketed the money but never finished it. If you keep in mind that this is 1481, which means Leonardo is 29, it's been rumored that this shepherd, lonely and standing on the side, is actually a self-representation of Leonardo at 29. Particularly because it looks a lot like this David, the David of Verrocchio, which we know from Vasari was a representation of Leonardo at 15. Remember, Leonardo apprenticed with Verrocchio, was his favorite student, and was the model for this David. Then there is this fresco by Bramante. Bramante is the guy who did the facade of St. Peter. He portrayed himself on the right as the laughing Democritus, and he portrayed Leonardo on the left as the crying Heraclitus. So this is Leonardo in 1497 at the age of 45. And then there is this thing. This is the only portrait by Leonardo of a man. It's called The Musician, was made in 1485 when Leonardo was 33 and had just arrived to Milan. In fact, it's kept in Milan, and it's called The Musician because it's holding a sheet of music. We do know that on that famous CV and letter of intent that Leonardo sent to Ludovico the Moor, he was extolling his skills as a gifted musician. Leonardo had a beautiful voice and accompanied himself with a lyre. So the theory is that this is actually himself. This is Leonardo da Vinci at 33. And then there is Vitruvian Man. And Vitruvian Man, which Leonardo produced in 1490 in Milan when he was 38, is a self-portrait. There is a book on it. So let's review. We got Leonardo at 33, Leonardo at 38, and Leonardo at 65. And if you look at it as an artist who look at it, you realize that there is the same broad forehead, the same horizontal high brows, the same long aquiline nose, the same curved lips, and the same small notched and well-developed chin. And it's very similar to that David by Verrocchio, which we know is Leonardo at 15. Also notice that he's got these prominent cheekbones. Doesn't really look very Italian, looks more Slavic. Now, Leonardo was born out of wedlock to a young woman named Caterina, who was working in the family that eventually raised Leonardo and was a very well-off family in Vinci. They took away the baby from Caterina and they raised him as their own. And this Caterina was rumored to be a Croatian slave that had been imported from Venetian slave traders. So Leonardo might have been the son of her, and Leonardo says very little about his mother other than when he was in Milan in his 40s, he has a note in his notebooks, today Caterina came to live with us. And people speculate that that was not a maid, but was actually his mother. And in fact, when Caterina dies, Leonardo spends a fortune on her funeral. But he was handsome. He was very attractive, well-proportioned, graceful, good-looking. He had beautiful curling hair, writes a contemporary, carefully styled, which came down to the middle of his chest. He wore a short, rose-pink tunic, knee-length, at a time when most people wore long gowns, always a party and a religion of one. Vasari writes, in appearance, he was so strikingly handsome that his magnificent presence brought comfort to the most troubled soul. But he was also generous, so that he fed all his friends, rich and poor. In fact, his disposition was so lovable that he commanded everyone's affection. And he was a sparkling and witty conversationalist, in fact so charming and persuasive that he could bend other people to his will. Yet he was also strong, so that with his right hand he could bend a horseshoe. Remember, this was a man that became a vegan because he did not want to inflict pain. He was famous to go through the markets of Florence and buy caged pigeons for the pleasure of freeing them. Many men and women, writes Vasari, are born with various remarkable qualities and talents, but only occasionally, in a way that transcends nature, a single person is endowed by heaven with beauty, grace, and talent in so much abundance. Everyone acknowledged that this was true of Leonardo da Vinci, an artist of outstanding physical beauty who displayed infinite grace in everything he did, and who cultivated his genius so brilliantly that all problems he studied were solved with ease. He was a man of great strength and dexterity, regal spirit, and amazing breadth of mind. So let's study the mind of Leonardo. And this is a mind that thought in pictures, okay? No doubt about it. Not most of us, in fact, a smaller part thinks in pictures, but we know now that this is the undercurrent of creativity and genius. This is the very first drawing we have of Leonardo when he was only 21, and these are the hills near Vinci, where he was born. All his thoughts come down as sketches and drawings. Text is very limited. And again, this is one of the latest papers that proves that if you do very well in visual spatial thinking, years down the line, you will have more landmark papers and more patents to your credit. Kenneth Clark writes, it's often said that Leonardo drew so well because he knew about things. It is truer to say that he knew about things because he drew so well. Now, Leonardo was aware of the power of visual over written. And he wrote poignantly about it in this amazing rendition of a Knox heart. On the left, you see the following words, and you got to flip it to read the Italian. And he writes, how can you describe this heart in words without filling a whole book? The longer you write, the more you would confuse the listener. And you would only end up knowing a few things, never the whole. Hence, draw first, and then describe later. And then on top, it goes for the jugulars. Writer, what kind of words will you fetch to awkwardly describe what drawing can instead so beautifully represent? Don't bother with words unless you're speaking to the blind. Don't mess with things that belong to the eyes. Don't try to smuggle them as something belonging instead to the ears. You will always be overruled by the painter. Interesting enough, in medicine, especially in the past, we didn't really agree with Leonardo. Take a look at what Oliver Wendell Holmes, professor of anatomy at Harvard, writes about this new anatomy textbook that had just been published. He is complaining that it has too many pictures. Let a student have illustrations, and just so surely he will use them at the expense of the text. Look, for instance, at two of the most successful anatomical books ever published, both of which have gone through several editions, and neither of them has a single illustration. He is blasting and bashing Gray's Anatomy, that had been just published with too many pictures. And yet, clearly, we do produce physicians who think in pictures. For example, take Frank Netter. Leonardo thought in pictures, and that's how he came up with all these innovations. Let's review them. First of all, the idea of exploded views, so that he could show parts and the whole. And to do that, he uses guidelines that gives the relationship of the parts to the whole. That is a constant. Also, he pioneers this idea of the multi-angle cinematographic view, multiple views, as if you were walking around the object. And then force lines, which means muscles, represented by strings, so you can again see the underlying anatomy. Lastly, he pioneers the standard three views of sagittal, coronal, and cross-sectional. He is the first to describe origin, insertion, and innervation of muscles, the agonist-antagonist function, the system of pronation and supination, the proper femur's position, and of course he realizes this is very good stuff, and he writes, "These drawings I've made of the human body appear to you very much as if you had the cadaver in front of your eyes. The reason this is so is because in order to really know anatomy, you have to turn the cadaver around, or alternatively, turn your eye, glancing from below, above, and the side, so the multi-angle cinematographic view." And then he pioneers the idea of starting doing cross-sections. Here he isolates the teeth, and believe it or not, he's the first to give us an accurate count of the teeth. Till then, we did not know. Notice also the fact that he's the first to give us a view of both the frontal and the maxillary sinuses. Interestingly enough, this is 150 years before Highmore. They are still referred as the Highmore antrum, should they be called the antra of Leonardo. Here, a more cross-section of the maxillary and the orbit, because Leonardo was looking for the seat of the soul, the common sense. Okay, so it's the side where all the senses converge. Leonardo was a believer it was in the brain. Other folks believed it was in the heart, and he placed it in the sella turcica. But that led to a lifelong interest in the nervous system. Here, beautiful cross-section, and what you're going to see here are the fossas and the meningeal arteries. Here, comparing them to the layers of an onion, he gives us a view of the multiple wrapping layers around the brain. And notice also that he represents the ventricles, and he pioneers the idea of injecting them with molten wax so he can get a cast of them. He will do the same with the human heart. Then he has a love affair with muscles, and particularly the brachial plexus. Takes him 20 years, but then eventually is able to completely unravel all its ramifications. He rediscovers, known to the Greeks, that some nerves are sensory, some are motor, and some are both. And finally, he intuits the reflex arc. He says, nerves sometimes work without the command of the soul. And the captain of this arc he places accurately in the spinal cord. He is the first to identify the agonist-antagonist action that will have to be rediscovered by Sherrington. And he writes, even this information can be inadequate because of the confusion caused by the overlapping structures, arteries, nerves, ligaments, bloods, and of course, the blood that stains everything of the same color. That's why you have to do more than one dissection. So, 3 for arteries and veins, 3 for ligaments, 3 for membranes, 3 for muscles and tendons, 3 for bones and cartilage, and make sure you sew the bones to see which are hollow and which are not. And lastly, 3 dissections for understanding the female anatomy, which harbors the great secret of life and over fetus. So Leonardo was after the soul. First he wanted to place it, and he placed it in the sella turcica, and then he wanted to identify when it implants itself. And that's why he got into this stuff. And he was also fascinated by the act. In fact, according to Sigmund Freud, is the subject of a lifelong fascination. People have speculated a lot about these drawings. They come across as cold and pretty dry. But let me point out what he writes on top. I revealed to men the origin of their first or perhaps second cause of existence. He's talking about the bodily existence and the spiritual existence. And then more interestingly, down here at the bottom, he writes the following. By means of these figures, the cause of many risks of ulcers and diseases will be demonstrated. What is he talking about? Well, in 1494, the Spaniards had brought to Italy this new disease that they had picked up in the Caribbean. The spirochete that eventually led to syphilis in the Caribbean was nothing more than a colonizer of the groin, but brought in this new environment had to reinvent itself a different niche, penetrate the genital canal, and all of a sudden there is an explosion of this new horrible disease. Everybody gets sick, and the Spaniards are sieging the city-state of Naples, and they get sick. The Spaniards call it the Italian disease. The Italians call it the Spanish disease. But then the French come down with their king, and they're French. They all get sick. Italians and the Spaniards get together and say, let's call it the French disease. And for 200 and some years will be the French disease till this poem by Girolamo Fracastoro will be rediscovered. Fracastoro writes 50 years after Leonardo, but Leonardo had intuited in the early 1500 that this was sexually transmitted. There is another thing which is interesting. The penis here is sectioned and there are two channels. Why is this important? Because Leonardo is the ultimate iconoclast. He relishes the fact of being an outsider. He goes after academia. And in fact, I think that is a very good approach. I always tell the medical students that the most important word in science is bullshit, because you got to basically challenge dogma in order to make breakthroughs. And yet, even Leonardo convinced himself that there were two channels in the penis, even though he only saw one. This is, again, the emperor has no clothes. Why? The great Galen used to say that the sperm has a separate channel that comes from the cord. So again, the power of dogma. Now, Sigmund Freud writes about how intellectual passion drove out sensuality. And I want you to take a look at this picture, which resurfaced just recently. This was part of the collection that the Queen had, and I would like to imagine the face of Queen Victoria when she saw that. She immediately sold it to the Germans and resurfaced in Berlin a few years ago. Now, this androgynous figure that has breasts and an erect penis became eventually the St. John the Baptist, okay? There were only two canvases that Leonardo kept at his bedside, literally at his bedside when he died, and they were John the Baptist and the Mona Lisa. And they are indeed both androgynous with a perplexing smile. My hunch is that he was trying to tell us that the soul is, and of right ought to be, androgynous. But again, Carlo Pedretti has written a beautiful book on this particular image. He claims that this was nothing more than the representation of one of his assistants, a kid that he had raised since the age of 8, called Salai. Still, Leonardo is the ultimate outsider, and proud of it. Let's review. He's a vegan in a country of gluttons. He's a left-handed man in a nation taught by the church that the left is the hand of the devil. And I still remember the nuns clubbing my left hand when I was trying to draw with that. He's a bastard in a society where only legitimate sons can hope for success. He's a self-educated ignoramus, shunned by the intelligentsia because he knows very little Latin that he taught himself and no Greek at all. And last but not least, he's a gay man in a macho culture. So he's the ultimate outsider, which is actually potentially good. Colin Wilson wrote this very interesting and provocative book in the 50s, claiming that the worst that they can do to you as a human being is not to kill you, is to marginalize you. In fact, that's what the Greeks did. They forced you out of the group. Ostracism is the worst thing that can happen because a societal species like ours thrives by being part of the group, unless you're so aware of your self-worth that your reaction will be, screw them, I'm much better and I'll prove it. There was recently a paper from Hopkins that showed that creativity can actually come from this being an outsider. And Leonardo tells us about the way he felt about being an outsider. I am fully conscious that not being a literary man, a man of letters, certain presumptuous folks might reasonably blame him for it. Fools! Don't they know that I might retort by saying that they who deck themselves in the labor of others don't know that these studies are to be dealt with experience rather than empty words? In other words, go for observation, don't rely on books. Experience has always been the mistress of those who wrote well, and I will always cite her as my mistress. Now, if you think that it's better to do your own dissections rather than studying on pictures, keep in mind that this would be true only if you could see at once all the things that are shown so clearly in my drawings. Yet, despite all your effort and intelligence, this would be impossible. You would see a jumble of structures. So he's telling us here the importance of these drawings. That's why the importance of doing many dissections. So let me tell you a little bit how this man's brain operates. It's 1507. in this hospital, which still stands a few yards from the train station, the oldest active hospital on the planet, founded by the father of the Beatrice of Dante. In the winter of 1507-1508, Leonardo da Vinci is talking to an old man, and he writes, "An old man, a few hours from his death, told me that he had lived more than 100 years, and that he felt nothing wrong with his body other than weakness. And thus, while sitting upon a bed in the Ospedale of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, without any movement or any other sign of mishap, he passed out of this life." This is a sweet scene. This old man who is alone, and Leonardo is listening to him, confides in himself in Leonardo and then passes. And what does Leonardo do? And I immediately made an autopsy of him, so that I could learn the cause of such a sweet death. And this, here's the insight, I found to be the result of arterial and hepatic insufficiency to both the heart and the lower extremities, which I found withered, wrinkled, and dry. So he has the insight of the malattia arteriosclerotica, as he calls it. So it was an easy autopsy. There was not a lot of humor, not a lot of blood. We actually have those words engraved not too far from my office. My office is in that building on the right, and behind this bronze plaque of aphorisms in medicine, on the curb you see, in badly spelled Italian, the words of Leonardo. He was dissecting in Santa Maria Nuova, and the basement where he was dissecting is available, except that being this Italy, they don't show it to you unless you have connections. So I have connections, and this March I went to see it. And this is where he dissected. So I want you to imagine the scene. This is winter. The winters in Florence are cold, which is good. You get more days out of a cadaver. And of course, it's all lit by torches. And this is not really legal. Although, why does he get to dissect people that die peacefully in the hospital? Because he leaves his money in the hospital. The hospital doubles as a bank. And the priests allow him to dissect people that have no family. So it's not really completely legal. He's got a few assistants, but he's the one doing the cutting. So they hold body parts. He also has to do the sketching. He probably does it with silver metal tip. And then he has to go back at night and finish them up with ink and pen. And in the morning, he has to make a living. That's not considering the personal physical risk of exposing himself to cuts. He did not know about the germ theory. That's what Leonardo was up to. Now, immediately after this, he does an autopsy of a kid, and he compares the two. And he realizes that the vessels are different. And here's what he writes. You have to flip it. Giovane on the left, the young vessels. Vecchio on the right, the old vessels, all twisted. And he writes, thicker coats. Why? Excessive nutrition. This excessive nutrition has eventually been picked up by the wall of the vessels and is choking it. And he writes about the malattia arteriosclerotica. Now, the fact that he was so voraciously curious and omnivorous is at the core of his insights. And he writes, the acquisition of any knowledge is always useful to the intellect because it serves to banish the useless things and retain only the good. Nothing can be loved or hated till you know them. Is, as Kenneth Clark put it, the most relentlessly curious man in history. He is right and left brain to the max. No two cultures, no CPs, no two cultures. And this is the epitome of the illusory boundaries between the two. So he gets this insight on the malattia arteriosclerotica because he knows about anatomy, he knows about hydraulics, and he knows about nutrition. And he writes, like iron rusts from disuse and stagnant water putrefies or turns into ice when kept cold, our intellect wastes unless we keep it in use. And true knowledge always has to come from observation and experience. And this is the definition of science. So even though we attribute science to Bacon and Galileo, Leonardo got there first. And he writes, those who love art without science are like mariners who go out to sea with neither rudder nor compass, so that they never know where they're going. Hence, study the science of art and the art of science. Here is the Leonardo's method. First is observation, which means visual spatial thinking. Then he comes up through inductive reasoning with a theory, which is called scienza. And then through arte, he puts it to the test and he revises that theory till he finally has completed a fantasia, which is Italian for imagination, but that's how he calls the final theory. And of course, when the universe stands open before our eyes, who needs to go to the fountain? Who needs to go to the books? He's actually boasting that he's a man of no letters, because they are a hindrance. So when medical knowledge was giving us this stuff, and this is a correlation between astrological science and diseases, Leonardo was giving us this stuff, which was the result of the first stage of his production, Anatomia Artistica. And of course, this was nothing more than a blueprint of human proportions. Leonardo writes, "From the breasts to the top of the head is a quarter of the height of man," and it matches. Also, he writes that the pubis is half of the way up to the body. So, the center of our body is the symphysis. This is important because take a look at this kid. Is disproportionate. Now, 1 out of 10,000 of us have been roaming the planet looking like that, but it took 1896 years after Jesus Christ for a French guy named Marfan to finally notice it. Leonardo used to say there are 3 kinds of people: those that see only when shown, and those that just can't see. Now, he was a spare-time painter, and he took all his vacations in Venice. And it's at the Academia of Venice that there is Vitruvian Man. I wonder if he saw it. But clearly, that's why I tell the medical students there are lots of diseases out there waiting for your name. You just got to see them. Now, this, of course, became iconic and nowadays has gone viral. The Italians actually have put it on the €1 coin, although recently has been suggested that maybe Vitruvian Man should get out of the euro. All of this because of this. It's actually even gone into space. And of course, after the artistic anatomy, he got into the medical anatomy, the Anatomia Physiologica and Pathologica. All of this because he wanted to learn about the meravigliosa macchina umana, the wonderful human machine, the nature of man. Sigmund Freud writes, "The artist had once taken into service the investigator in order to assist him. Now the servant, the scientist, has grown stronger and thus suppressed his master. He's interested in eyes and vision, in the CNS, in muscles and bones, in the abdominal organs, in the heart and the vessels, the reproductive, and ultimately the fetus." Let's review briefly while we're coming towards an end. First of all, it's all drawings. Anatomy is drawings, the text is mostly physiology, and most of it is wrong. Now, the drawings, of course, you have to read them by flipping them because it's right to left. Okay, why did he do right to left? 3 major theories. Number 1, he was dyslexic. Now, if you look at his eyes, particularly in Vitruvian Man, which is frontal, they are a little misaligned. So one of the theories is that if you have misaligned eyes, you are not going to do too well with the printed word, and you do become more visual. And if you look at Picasso, for example, his eyes are a little bit misaligned. Klimt, they're a little misaligned. And of course, the big question is how many dyslexics will pass an MCAT? But that's a different story. So anyway, so he does write because maybe he's a dyslexic. Secondly, if you write in ink and you have flowing robes, you're less likely to smear the page if you write right to left. Third theory, he was paranoid. And he was basically trying to protect his secrets. Doubted. By the way, Leonardo writes beautiful Italian. Succinct, beautiful Italian. The Italian tends to be convoluted and long. When Harrison's textbook of internal medicine was translated from English into Italian, went from 1 volume to 5 volumes. But the only one that really remains succinct is Dante, beautiful Italian, and Leonardo. He does a little bit of comparative anatomy, uses these strings and wires to indicate muscles. He is the first to give us the curvature of the spine and the accurate rendition of all the vertebral bodies. He does cross-sections. He uses strings and wires to mimic the presence of muscles, does that a lot. And then finally, he gets into the CNS. He loves the CNS. I told you about the cast of the ventricles, and he's the first to give us a rendition of the chiasm. He also intuits the first to do so, that the eye doesn't project light onto the object, receives light. And then finally, he gets into the cranial nerves. He identifies all of them with the exception of the fourth, the trochlear, depicts the foramen of Morrow, gives us some renditions of camera oscura, gets into the muscles, which he uses a lot for his anatomy. And I would like to bring your attention to this drawing. There is profound respect to the dignity of the human figure in Leonardo across the board. These are cadavers, they are very dignified. He, of course, uses this for artwork, but the reason why I'm bringing up this dignity of his representation of man is because of this. Who has seen this in a body world? Yeah, I find Van Hagen's work not to really bring out the dignity of the individual. These are bodies. There's no individual left behind. And actually, has been written about it. When you look at this, there is disgust and fascination. Leonardo doesn't do that. Sherwin-Nuland wrote, "None brought forward that wealth of anatomical detail with more reverence for life than Leonardo, whether the life was human or animal." Gets into the muscles, beautiful pronation, supination. It does get into the fascia, beautiful rendition of the palmar fascia. Guidelines again. Notice the study of facial expression. Of course, the muscles of facial expression. Gets into the belly a little bit. He's the first to represent the appendix. Till then, has never been represented. And then finally into the heart, and I'm wrapping up. He creates a model in glass with millet seeds to serve as a dye to get a sense of why valves close. And he realizes that it's the eddies that do that. It's not the pressure. And it's because he studies hydraulics. He describes the sinuses of Valsalva 200 years before Valsalva. And finally, he gets into the capillaries, which he names the capillaries, comparing them to the hair of our head. And lastly, the heart. Let's review it. Through multiple angles, is the first to state that the heart is a muscle, the first to describe it as four-chambered, the first to understand the auricles, the first to describe a patent foramen ovale, the first to draw and understand the valves correctly, and the first to work out the coronary circulation. And still to this day, at least on Italian textbooks of anatomy, the motorador band on the right side is named after Leonardo. And then finally this, which leads to this, and he goes to France. When Leonardo quits medicine, this is the state of the art. Leaves much to be desired on regular standard run-of-the-mill books. Leonardo was producing this and this. Particularly the one on the right is amazing. I have a tie where I actually commissioned this to be put on. This is a rendition of the organs of the female anatomy, and they are beautiful and accurate. So he goes to France and he comments, "The Medici made me and the Medici destroyed me." Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Medici, had actually made him as a young man, and his descendant as popes had destroyed him. He's also a pun. Leonardo is full of puns. His brain worked that way. And the Medici is Italian for the physicians, and he hated physicians. He writes, this is Kenneth Clark, "Of all the great Renaissance artists, Da Vinci alone was destined to fall from papal grace. In a larger sense, he was more dangerous than Borgia. Caesar had just killed man. Da Vinci, like Copernicus, threatened the certitude that knowledge had been forever fixed by God. The rigid mindset left no role for curiosity or innovation. Leonardo's cosmology, in effect, was a blunt instrument assaulting the fatuity which had, among other things, permitted a mafia of profane popes to desecrate Christianity." Leonardo is quite philosophical about it. He writes, "Equanimity protects against misfortune as warm clothes protect against the cold. The warmer you dress, the more powerless the storm. In the same way, by increasing your equanimity in the face of great wrongs, you render them powerless against your peace of mind." He also tries to give himself a recipe for longevity. If you want to be healthy, observe the following. Don't eat when you have no appetite and dine lightly. He knew about reflux. Chew well, and whatever you take into you should always be well cooked and of simple ingredients. He who takes medicine is ill-advised. Beware anger and avoid stuffy air. Stay standing a while when you get up from a meal. Make sure you don't sleep at midday. Let your wine be mixed with water, taken a little and often, but don't drink between meals and not on an empty stomach. Neither delay nor prolong your visits to the private. And if you take exercises, let it not be too strenuous. Don't lie with your belly upward and your head downward. You knew about aspiration pneumonia. And be well covered at night. Rest your head, keep your mind cheerful, avoid wantonness, keep to this diet, and when you finally learn how to live, you will learn how to die. But the best way to preserve your health is by keeping as far away from physicians as you possibly can, since their medicines are always the product of quacks. Yet, we continue giving them money. The doctors, destroyers of life. Hence, they must be rich. So, he gives us a summa of what it means to do what he did, and he writes, even if you love the research, you may be hindered by a weak stomach. And if you're not hindered by that, you may be hindered by fear of being at night in the company of these bodies, torn to pieces, skin, frightening. And even if that doesn't bother you, you may lack the drawing skills, or the perspective, or the arrangement of the geometrical representation, or you may tire and not be thorough. Whether or not I have succumbed to these things, you may judge for yourself. But if I have failed, it's not because of negligence or laziness, but only because of time. Farewell. And he gets ready for his death. Like a day well spent brings a happy sleep, so a life well spent brings a peaceful death. And he passes. Melzi writes to his brothers, I understand that you've been informed of the death of Master Leonardo, your brother, who was like an excellent father to me. It's impossible to express the grief I feel at his death, and as long as my limbs sustain me, I will feel eternal sadness, which is justified by the consuming and sweet love he bore daily towards me. Everyone is grieved by the loss of such a man, whose like nature no longer has it in her power to produce. And now may Almighty God grant him eternal rest. Vasari, 50 years later, writes, Heaven sometimes sends us beings who represent not humanity alone, but divinity itself. Through the birth of Leonardo, Florence received a great gift, and through his death, it sustained an incalculable loss. The last words for Kenneth Clark. Like his contemporaries, we no longer think of Leonardo as a scientist, as a seeker for measurable truth. We think of him as a magician, a man who, from his close familiarity with the processes of nature, has learned the disturbing secret of creation. And it is actually very true that there is a school of thought that believes that when Shakespeare wrote the character of Prospero for his very last play, The Tempest, he had Leonardo da Vinci in mind. So I'm going to stop here. It's a full hour. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate all the help you gave us, and thanks so much.